Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. My guest today is Dr. Eman Abdelhadi, professor at the University of Chicago, author of a forthcoming academic book called Impossible Futures: Why Women Leave American Muslim Communities, as well as the co-author of a speculative fiction novel called Everything for Everyone. Eman is also the subject of a documentary called Coming Around that is now, if you're listening to this at the end of July 2023, screening virtually at the Outfest Film Festival in Los Angeles. The documentary portrays Eman's relationship with her mother, a devout Palestinian Muslim woman who raised Eman and her siblings as a single mother in small-town Missouri. It is a nuanced portrayal of their deeply loving and complicated coming around to each other in spite of their differences. I particularly appreciated how it captured the ambiguity of coming out in stages over time in different ways. When I first came out to my father, I had no narratives of what it was to come out to a Muslim or Pakistani parent. Eman's story reflects many elements of my own and of others that I've heard over time. In this conversation, we talk about the documentary, Eman's sociological work on Muslim American communities, and what's happening with the conversation in those spaces around queerness now, and about other places where themes of family, blood, found, and otherwise emerge. Welcome. Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Eman Abdelhadi, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, also the subject of a documentary called Coming Around, and the co-author of a book called Everything for Everybody. We're going to get into all of these things. And first, Eman, welcome. Hi. Thank you for coming on here and talking to us.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Lena. I'm so excited to chat.
Great. Eman, for people who don't know you and your work, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, I think of myself as an academic and an artist and an activist. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm Arab American and queer and Muslim, and I lived in New York for many years.
So where in the Midwest did you grow up?
I grew up in a town in mid-Missouri called Columbia. It's a college town where the University of Missouri is.
Okay. So that's something I'm very curious to ask you more about. And let's start with the documentary. So you're the subject of a documentary that you mentioned is making the round. It's on the film festival circuit right now. Mm-hmm. I had a chance to watch it. It is excellent. How would you introduce it?
The documentary is a love story between me and my mom. It's really a mother-daughter love story. It's about the ways that we manage to love each other and interact with each other and show up for each other, despite having very, very different views of the world. So my mother is devout Muslim, and her version of Islam and religiosity is relatively black and white, whereas I am a heterodox Muslim who practices in my own strange ways and some normative ways too, I would say. But yeah, we don't follow the same interpretations. So we lead very different lives, and in many ways I lead a life that isn't always legible to her. And she takes stances that are legible to me but frustrating. So the movie is an alternative to a coming out story, in which you come out and either you're accepted or you're not, and either you stay or you don't based on that outcome. In our story, there's a lot of coming around to each other over and over in different ways. And the process of creating a space where we can both be ourselves is very iterative. So documents a series of events, including me marrying a partner, a cis man that I happen to be with because, my mother wanted me to, and the sort of aftermath of this choice.
So I was struck just now by your characterization of it being an iterative process of you coming around to each other. That resonates very deeply, both with my story and with the stories of many people whom I know whose identities and backgrounds overlap in various ways with yours and or mine. I thought the documentary was really beautiful. The warmth with your mom was immediately very apparent, as is the fact that you are both very, very strong and not headstrong, but, just very powerful people in your own ways, right? She cuts a very interesting figure in the documentary in so many ways, because as you say, your story defies reductive narratives, and she's also very hard to reduce into a box, right?
Yes.
I was also struck by this dilemma of telling your family certain things, knowing exactly what they will think and say, and still making the decision to tell them and being really open about that. And I also just wanted to say thank you about being so open about mental health, because that's another thing that doesn't get talked about, I think, nearly enough. And especially right now, I think it's really important to name.
Yeah. So couple of comments on what you said. One is, I say in the documentary that my mom and I are the same person. and in reality, I mean, I think we have very similar personalities. Mm-hmm. We are both people who have chosen non-normative paths in our own ways. My mom, after my father passed away, chose not to remarry. She redid her entire career and, raised children as a single mother in a community that didn't have many single mothers and didn't really kind of understand this as a social form. And still, because of how big of a figure she is, she was so central to her community. And so in many ways, we're very similar people. We just have different opinions on a set of different things. And I think that in some ways, our similarities are part of the struggle, because we're both very headstrong, as you note. We're both very insistent on living true to our values. But at the same time, the similarities are helpful in that we can understand each other's desire to live by our values. And I think that's a big theme in the film, is that each of us feels she has to do right by what she thinks and believes. And fundamentally, we both respect each other's desire for that authenticity and for that claim. I think that in terms of, so yes, many of us struggle with what to tell our families, knowing that they are going to disagree and that they are going to react poorly. For me, was a mental health imperative to come out in quotation marks. For me, I grew up in a community where a woman's reputation was the most important thing. And there was really no leeway for young women to experiment, no leeway to stray, no leeway to just explore different parts of themselves without sort of being told that this exploration would have monumental and long-term and irreversible consequences for their ability to lead a Muslim life. And so for a long time, because I was the kind of person who at the same time is not very good at taking other people's word for things, I needed to experiment and I needed to stray and I needed to do these things. And so I lived a double life. And I think that's something that a lot of young Muslims deal with. I explore this in a lot of my research as a sociologist. I study Muslim Americans, and you see this happen over and over, where young people are pulled in different directions. And that's a normal developmental thing, right? That's a normal part of growing up, is to kind of try out different hats. And Muslim men are given the leeway to do that, whereas young women often are not. So for me, I led a double life like many of my counterparts, and it wore on me, year after year, constantly, lying to one person or another, being constantly afraid of being caught. It was extremely psychologically damaging. And I think I couldn't divorce it from the idea that I was fundamentally doing something wrong. And so, I had a huge mental health crisis in my early 20s. And that mental health crisis was the final straw. And I was like, wasn't a straw. I guess it was a wake-up call that I couldn't do this anymore. And in the wake of that crisis, my family really rallied around me, and it made me realize that they were more resilient than I had given them credit for, and probably more accepting than I had given them credit for. And that I think the mental health crisis made them see how much was at stake in these battles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made a very conscious decision with myself that I would live very authentically from then on, that I would not lie, that I would just quote unquote come out. And at that point, it wasn't coming out about queerness. It was coming out about everything else. And so I think that part of what doesn't show up in the documentary, but is very important, is that coming out to my mother as queer was the sort of cherry on top, right? It was the end of the road. I had already for 10 years been coming out to her about everything else in my life, coming out about the fact that I had stopped wearing the hijab. I wore the hijab when I was 9 years old. I wore it into my early 20s, and at some point I stopped wearing it in my daily life in New York, but hadn't really told anyone and wasn't posting on social media. Coming out about having heterodox views, coming out about the idea that I wasn't going to pursue a sort of the traditional marriage route, all of these different things, that resetting my own expectations for my life and resetting her expectations for my life. But the mental health component of it was enormous. I think there's this way in Muslim communities where we often just think that it's okay, don't tell them, it's okay. Like, why do they have to know? And sometimes that works, but also sometimes that takes a huge toll. And we don't really talk about that toll.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how much even our heterosexual counterparts hide from their parents in terms of exploring their identities and who they are as young adults.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways I got this from some of my straight Muslim friends, where it was just like, why do you bother,
Just don't tell them. Yeah.
I think part of it, and I hope this comes off in the documentary, and I don't know that it does, but I take my mom very seriously as a person. Sometimes even my siblings will say, like, well, it's Mama. What did you think she was going to say? Like, why do you even bother with these fights? And I'm like, because she deserves to be taken seriously. And I would hate to think that someone would write me off, would think that it wasn't worth trying to convince me of something. I think I've learned to back off, and to not not punish her for her views and not withhold affection and these things. And I think she's worked on doing the same for me. But at the end of the day, I will always tell her my opinion, because what she thinks matters to me. And I take her seriously as a thinking person in the world. Like, I'm not writing her off as just a relic of a different time.
Right. I mean, her sharpness comes across in the documentary, like her astuteness. And I appreciate you saying how much you respect that about her. I was curious how the documentary came about.
Yeah. Like many things, it came about somewhat coincidentally. The filmmaker, Sandra, had interviewed me for a small project about a role I played in a protest, and then decided she wanted to do her thesis film. She was in graduate school. She decided initially that she wanted to do her thesis film on me and 2 other young Muslim activists in the city. And then as she began filming and workshopping what she was filming, she decided she wanted to do a more intimate story, and she was particularly interested in me. And then shortly during that process, the Orlando massacre happened in 2016, and I publicly came out on social media as queer, and many of us who were queer Muslims and did queer Muslim organizing ended up sort of in the public eye. So we ended up doing a lot of media interviews, because there was suddenly all this interest in queer Muslims and how they were reacting to this and what spaces they occupied, etc. So I was very visible for a moment as a queer Muslim person. And Sandra was interested particularly, so she did a long interview with me, and I ended up just talking about my mother. I think if you know me at all, I talk about my mom all the time because she's just such an interesting and amazing person. And so she got really curious about that. And the next time I was going to Missouri, she asked if she could film some of our dynamic. And so, I broached the topic with my mom. I told her that Sandra was interested in our relationship, that she was particularly interested in how we managed our differences. My mom was open to being filmed. And so she started kind of coming and filming in Missouri. And it just so happened that these events, I had started dating the man I married in the film, and so she came with us for that, and so she filmed intermittently for years. Yeah.
Wow. How many years?
Overall, the film appears condensed to take place over the course of like a year and a half, but really we filmed for closer to 6 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
6 years.
Yeah.
Okay. That's incredible. So it's making the rounds on film festivals now.
So the next place that it's showing is Los Angeles. It's going to be at the Outfest Film Festival. It's showing on July 22nd at 7:30 p.m. at the DGA. But afterwards, after the in-person festival closes, there will be a virtual screening room for about a week. So folks can see it between the 24th and the 30th of July virtually.
That's
through
great.
Outfest.
That's great. I was able to catch the virtual screening at the Frameline Festival, which that's wonderful that they're doing that.
Yes.
Great. Can I ask about your process of coming to understand yourself as queer?
Yeah. I always like to joke that I am what the right is afraid of, where young kids,
Beautiful.
where young college kids are reading about queerness, are like taking a queer theory class, and then suddenly realize they're gay. Like I was absolutely recruited by the gay agenda.
Amazing.
Never looked back. Yeah, it was in college in reading queer theory that I started to realize that a lot of what I had been recoded for me as like, a girl crush, or, all these ways that straight culture recodes, same
gal pals.
Yeah, same gender desire. I was like, oh wait, that was desires. And it's interesting because, I was like president of my high school MSA, but also in the Gay Straight Alliance. I'm like, what a cliche. Like the straight kid was like, I just think we need to be a good ally, and like happens to always, for some reason, have gay friends, and then I was like, oh shit. And then I entered my first queer relationship after college in graduate school. I went straight to graduate school after college. So like my second year of grad school, I started dating someone who identified as a woman at the time. And it was, I kind of just never looked back after that. I was like, yep, all right, here it is. These are my people.
I had a not dissimilar experience taking an intro to anthropology course, and it was the sexuality unit that did it for me, right? Just set my head on fire every night when I left. And then just that little bit of information, like, oh, most places, most times you find something like this, right? So it's normal.
Yeah.
And that did a lot to take the charge out. So then one of the things that the documentary shows really highlights is you and the queer Muslim specifically community that you found in New York. How was it connecting with them? And then just what was that like for you?
It was revelatory. I mean, I know that a lot of people say this. It's the reason I'm still Muslim today, that I met queer Muslims. I was very religious as a child and as a teenager. And as a college student, in fact, I was president of my MSA in college. I was very practicing, very oriented towards God. Really, the cultivation of the self that is such a big part of Muslim tradition has always appealed to me and continues to. But I really felt like, okay, I can't do this and that, right? Like not just queerness, but everything. That I just felt like the kind of normative Muslim spaces, I just couldn't wrap my head around getting a fatwa from a 16th century text, right?
Right.
In this sense that like this kind of sense of being frozen, in our interpretations, the reverence for the classical tradition that. Yeah, so I thought, okay, I don't know how to make these things work together, and had this, decision that I was going to live authentically, and so I was no longer willing to kind of cosplay good Muslim girl when I went to the mosque or, the Islamic center or whatever, and so I was just like, enough, enough. And so I thought, okay, like it was just starting to fade from my life. And then what happened was I met a few people. There's a very important person in my life who I had met her at mainstream Muslim events, and we had like shared some kind of rage over a bad talk about feminism, at this mosque, and we were just like, ugh. And then I kind of knew she was queer before she told me, because she had this blog and she had like a picture of herself holding a sign on the blog, and I recognized her hands, which to this day is probably the creepiest story ever about me.
Or the gayest.
Exactly. The gay, I was like, oh, nice hands. It's like,
I know those hands.
So I recognize her hands. So I secretly knew she was queer. And I was dating someone at the time, and I brought them by she, her pronouns at the time. So I brought my girlfriend at the time to a couple of events just as a friend. And so this queer Muslim person invited me over one time to hang out, and she said, so this person that I saw with you, I saw her with you here and I saw her with you there, what's
cowbells,
what's the and that's my best friend. I was like, so I just took a deep breath. I was like, all right, trust the hand recognition. And I said, oh, that's my partner. And she said, oh, great. Okay, cool. I'm queer too. Here's where we meet. Here's the email list. Add you to the email listserv. It's a whole thing. It was just like,
you got recruited.
Yeah, recruited.
Excellent.
The gay Muslim agenda in full swing. And and it was life-changing. It was life-changing because the next Ramadan, I spent every single day eating iftar, doing like Quran study with other queer folks, eating iftar with other queer folks. Basically, it was the first time in my life that I prayed in a gender integrated space, in a non-hierarchical space. These spaces were the most religiously diverse spaces I've ever been in. Everything from people who wore hijab and prayed 5 times a day and never missed a fast, to people who identified as ex-Muslim, and just having everybody in between, and people making a lot of space for each other, a lot of space, for there are going to be people who do the Quran study, and there are people who are not going to do the Quran study, right? And there are people who are going to have fasted, and there are people who are not going to have fasted, right? So that opened up this space in Muslimness that just really rescued my faith, I think. It really was, I was like, oh, no, I can do this. I can do Islam like this. And it's not an Islam that I think is theologically or jurisprudentially impossible. I mean, you don't have a religion that lasted 1,400 years from every corner of the globe without that religion being amenable to diversity and change. And it's only in the last 100 years that we've completely calcified it, right? That we've kind of just frozen it. And I think people are rejecting that frozen version of Islam every day because it just doesn't fit. It doesn't work. It only works if you're in extremely sheltered environments. And even then, it's deeply compartmentalized. And I don't think it has to be. I really don't.
This sounds like it bridges to your academic work and the perspective you've developed through your research. Sure. Curious just to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I wrote my dissertation on the differences in people. So I was wondering about this question of, why is it that some people's Muslimness is front and center and some people's Muslimness is receding in the background? So I started out kind of wondering who's engaged in Muslim spaces and who isn't. And is that something to do with upbringing? How does that come about? And what I ended up finding was this interesting gender story where there's a segment of the Muslim community that's just embedded in Muslim spaces their whole lives. And what I mean by embedded is they're just involved. They're Muslim, they mostly hang out with other Muslims. They're mostly in Muslim community. Basically, their social lives revolve around Muslim spaces. But for most people, their lives are sort of a mix and match, right? And even if their parents were embedded, adolescents begin to sort of experiment and begin to explore different parts of themselves. What I find is that women, as I was talking about this earlier, so there's a big gender difference in what happens in that early experimental phase. So men are given
And you're talking about American Muslims, right?
American Muslims.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. This is about American Muslims. So among American Muslims, you have folks, both young girls and boys, experimenting with different identities in their early adolescence. But for girls, this experimentation is clamped down very quickly, is punished. Girls are surveilled, they're monitored. And boys, on the other hand, are given a lot of room to experiment, to play around. There's this idea that, that boys will be boys, that boys need space and room to grow and figure things out before they grow up. Whereas for women, it's sort of like, one mistake and you're out. And what ends up happening is this system inadvertently pushes women out of the community. So what I find is that women are more likely to leave and never come back, whereas men leave periodically, compartmentalize until they're ready to kind of lead the good Muslim life. And when they do, they sort of come back into the fold. They drop the parts, the behaviors that are problematic. They look for a Muslim spouse. And they sort of try to lead the life that their parents expected them to live. So this is a big part of the story. Is not necessarily about queer people. It certainly applies to queer folks, but is most of my research is on sort of cishet Muslim American folks where this is happening.
So different set of things are being asked of women than are being asked of men.
Absolutely. And I think the reason for that, it has actually very little to do with Islam as a religion and very little to do with Muslim edicts. I think it's more that the community places all of its anxieties about the future onto women's shoulders. So the sense that, if our daughters wear bikinis, all is lost, right? The worst thing that one could imagine is a young girl dating, for example. That this signifies the end of the continuity of the community. And so there's all this anxiety about, is Islam in America going to survive? And all of that anxiety comes out in this gendered way. And to be perfectly fair, this is not unique to Muslims. I mean, people place their cultural and moral anxieties on women all the time. Like, why are we so obsessed with abortions, right? Why are we so obsessed with all of these things that women do? And why have we always been obsessed with them? Because we see women as the moral frontiers, right? Women are what women do, how they dress, who they sleep with, is a sign of the kind of moral code. And the Muslim community is no different. Its anxieties are a little different.
And what I hear in what you're saying is an interesting paradox, because without letting go of some of this, is the community going to survive if the women decide not to return?
It's in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's definitely it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it happens when all the sort of women who don't conform or who are on the margins leave Muslim spaces. It reinforces the idea that the only good Muslims look like a certain way, right? If the only Muslims left at the mosque dress in a particular way or whatever, you sort of can't see everything else because the other women basically select out of the space or are pushed out of the space. So it's a self-reinforcing cycle, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the long run.
I mean, I also hear that a similar paradox in your story, and how connecting with the queer Muslim community was what kept you in the faith, right?
Yeah.
And that has so much to do with the spaces, what more orthodox spaces are like, how alienating they are and can be, and how transformative finding a Muslim space that is queer, and not just queer for me, but queer is. So,
and I think what's happening right now is I think a lot of mainstream Muslims, as the kind of queer and trans rights are at the forefront of conversation in those debates, I think what we're seeing is that some of these supposed community and spiritual leaders would rather have us leave Islam than stay and claim Muslimness and queerness at the same time.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. For people who are listening who may not have that context, how would you summarize, encapsulate what is going on right now?
There have been a number of controversies in Muslim communities. Basically, in a couple of Muslim enclaves in Michigan, there was a huge controversy over the inclusion of trans folks in public schools and general queer visibility. And most recently, last month, a statement or an open letter was written by a number of Muslim scholars and signed off on by a number of Muslim organizations, I think nearly 200, that basically says that queerness is definitively outside of the faith, that any alternative interpretation is categorically wrong, not valid. Not just that they disagree with it, but that it's not valid. It doesn't actually exist in a real way. And that they are lamenting the influence of the quote unquote queer agenda on Muslim communities and are effectively worried that Muslims are becoming too accepting. And most kind of, to me, and the most stark thing in the end, calls on politicians to protect Muslims and their children from exposure to LGBTQ issues in schools. And to be fair to the Muslim American community writ large, one, these are not elected officials, right? Like, these are people with some institutional power. There was a lot of pushback, even from people who are considered very orthodox. And it's generated a lot of controversy, especially the political piece of it.
It's aligning itself with the right.
And it's aligning itself with the right. I mean, it's incredibly American to have this much political amnesia that you're suddenly aligning yourself with a party that built its reputation for the last 20 years on hating Muslims and is responsible for the deaths of millions of Muslims. I mean, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Syria, 3.5 million people died in the war on terror. 3.5 million people, primarily Muslims. And for this to be worth that, others have also pointed to this hypocrisy that, you live in a secular / Christian supremacist society. Your kids are exposed to all kinds of things that are outside of Islam. Why this, right? Why isn't there a statement about all of us having to, and I saw this on Twitter, I want to attribute it to whoever, but why isn't there a statement about how all of us have to pay interest in this economy? And why are we not asking politicians to protect us from having to pay interest, which is so categorically un-Islamic? So it's very controversial. The other thing, and I will say as a sociologist, it's not clear that it represents the majority opinion in the community.
For sure.
So I've worked with survey data on Muslim Americans for the last 10 years. And the best survey we have, a probability sample, is from the Pew Research Center. And what you see is basically the question that's asked on there is, would you agree or disagree with this statement? And the statement is, homosexuality should be encouraged by society. And yeah, I know it's not a great survey statement. It's not a great survey question.
Eman is looking at my face on Zoom right now.
This is always what I have to deal with when I have to explain how ridiculous social science is. I'm like, okay. But even this very kind of conservative question, we've seen Muslim Americans move with the general public in terms of acceptance of homosexuality. And in 2017, 61% of those surveyed said yes to that question, said they agreed that, that homosexuality should be encouraged by society. So we don't know what that means.
Well, that's hopeful.
Yeah, we don't know what that means. We don't know if that means they think it's haram or halal. But it seems very unlikely that this 61% would be like, yes, my main legislative priority is protecting my kids from exposure to something that I believe should be encouraged by society, right? It doesn't make sense. So the problem is the people who wrote that statement, they have control of all the resources and money of our collective community. And they have all this institutional power. And they claim to represent us when, in fact, even in the data, they don't. So I don't know.
I saw how many people were really disappointed, especially with certain of the names on that list.
Yeah.
Now, that's not a world that I'm immersed in at all. And just the impact that it had on the people around me, it was
Yeah.
terrible. As somebody who doesn't have that much skin in the games in terms of being very religious, in one sense, I was like, okay, this is like not a shock. And in the other sense, it has also profoundly shaped my life, how unwelcome I feel in mainstream Muslim spaces,
Yeah.
right? Profoundly. There's entire swaths of my family I'm not speaking or avoiding, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So this letter came out and it's sparked some backlash and a lot of discourse is my impression. What is your feeling on what the way forward is?
I think before this letter, there was this way that you could kind of assume the best. There was kind of don't ask, don't tell relationship, you know, between mainstream Muslim communities and queerness. It was sort of like, just show up. Everyone is welcome at a mosque. No one's going to say anything, you know, and I think the more progressive voices in the community would just not say anything. They wouldn't say queer people welcome here, but they would say, they wouldn't give a khutbah about queerness. They wouldn't give a sermon about it. They wouldn't. And likewise, you know, I remember one of the people that signed this thing, he has all these beautiful kind of spiritual series on YouTube and whatever. And I would listen to it. I would listen to some of these with my mom and my sister and when I was feeling spiritually low. And I would just kind of try to not think about his politics around this, right? But now the lines have been drawn, right? Now we know the line has been drawn in the sand and we know where people are. And so I think that benefit of the doubt is gone. And I think that's enormously important because it's one thing for me to give you the benefit of the doubt and to show up to a space, knowing that you're not going to ask and I'm not going to ask. It's another thing to now know that I'm entering a space that doesn't welcome me and that made it its political priority to state that lack of welcome. And so I think that at this point, and I think it's not just about queers. It is absolutely not just about queers. It is not that just queer people are going to stop going to these places. Anyone who is progressive is now facing a dilemma about these institutions. And so I think the way forward is to build alternative institutions. I used to be someone who believed that we could make room and share space. But now it is very clear that we cannot. And I want to raise my kids Muslim. And I know as a sociologist who studies growing up Muslim, that you can't really raise your kids Muslim without Muslim community.
If you don't have a space.
You can't. It just, that's not how the religion works. It's a communal faith. So then the question becomes, where do I take those kids? Right now, there are very few spaces. And I think the next 10 years for queer Muslims, but also for progressive Muslims in general, or nonconformist Muslims, or whatever you want to call them, we need to build these alternative institutions for ourselves because we need to stop thinking that they're going to be provided to us in the mainstream community. And I think that people will be surprised at how many people come, because even in my research interviews, I had people who had, for example, interfaith marriages, cis straight people who had interfaith marriages and they couldn't find anybody to marry them. And they went to the queer Muslim imam, you know, and there's this sense of like queer Muslim leadership on this front. And so I'm hopeful. And in some ways, I think the silver lining is that we can stop wasting our energy and time.
So you believe, I agree with you, that it's going to spark a proliferation of alternative spaces. Yeah. So what did it take to move you out of, I'm assuming that you had a sense, maybe you didn't, right? Did you ever have a sense that your queerness was at odds with your faith? And what did it take to move you out of that?
I did have a sense that my queerness was at odds with my faith. I went through the kind of usual trajectory of thinking that queerness was, that there was room for queerness and queer desire, but not queer acts, that queer acts were themselves problematic in the faith. And I moved away from that for two reasons. One is that I actually kind of stopped believing in a lot of the regulation of sexuality because for me, and I'm an academic and a sociologist, so I think a lot about the social structures of earlier Muslim communities. And so to me, it makes sense. And I'm not a like theologian. I'm not a Muslim scholar. I'm just talking about what makes sense to me. But, I studied a little, like I took an Islamic law class in college. I've read more than the average person. And I think that in a lot of senses, my understanding is that there's a difference between the things that are immutable in the faith, and to me, those are things like worship and belief. Or actually, Layla Ahmed makes this point in Women and Gender in Islam. And then there's the sort of social aspects of the faith, the regulation of social life, right? So things like how much a debtor owes, or like building codes or things like that. And I think my understanding is that scholars have always thought about, okay, well, what's the point of the rule? As opposed to the verbatim letter of the law, it's sort of about the spirit of the law. And to me, it makes sense that in 6th century Arabia, where you have no modern state and you have no other form of social organization, you would need to regulate sexuality. It actually kind of makes sense to me. Like, it makes sense to me that you would be concerned about who was whose father, because who your father was determined whether you ended up on the street, or whether you had food to eat, or somebody was going to protect you from random people killing people on the street. And I just don't see how that applies anymore. I just don't get it. Yeah. So I think in general, I have a very heterodox view of a lot of these rules. I'm just less concerned about them. And it was very important for me to read Scott Kugel's Homosexuality in Islam. I think he makes very cogent arguments about what alternative interpretations of the verses regarding homosexuality in the Quran. And so I think I think it was a two-way thing, as one, being less concerned with what the classical tradition or classical interpretations are saying, and being exposed to alternative interpretations at the same time. So it's not that I needed to have the alternative explanations first. I think those came later. But I think just a lot of space has opened up for me around interpretation in general of these texts.
Thank you. I'm always interested in that question because I remember being a teenager and coming to certain realizations about myself and having this process where I sifted through all the things that I'd heard about homosexuality. Now, this is the mid-90s. Yeah. I grew up in the Middle East with one very, very homophobic parent figure in particular. Nothing I heard was good. Absolutely nothing. And that process of sifting through and deciding for myself was very formative. Yeah. Like the entire so-called coming out, the process took years. And, I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah. And I think we get accused of being the only people who sort of reinterpret the text. Everybody's such a purist about the text when it comes to this. But people have different interpretations of all kinds of things. And the average lay Muslim does not derive every thought that, she has about the faith from like a mufti, So this is also a fight about authority.
It is. I mean, that gets into like gender and patriarchy and all. Yeah. So I have a wondering, it's interesting to me that people take this issue, what other people are doing with their bodies, their sexuality, their gender, that they take this issue so personally. Right?
Yeah. Honestly, flabbergasted by that as well. And you know what's funny? And I don't know how this will come off. I trust you as an editor. But I keep coming back to this hilarious and horrible phrase that George Bush used to say, that they hate us for our freedom. And it was so hilarious. But actually, I keep thinking about it and kind of laughing because I'm like, they hate us for our freedom.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think that people who feel extremely constrained and duty-bound to live a particular kind of life are enraged by the idea that you might choose a different one. And it's not just sexuality. You see this in all kinds of things, it's like, think about the disdain that sometimes people have for like artists, right? It's like, how dare you try to make it in this non-conventional path when I had to slog my way through medical school or whatever, there's just this rage at the idea that other people had freedoms you didn't have. And
or you opted out of. Yeah.
Or that you opted out of, right? And I mean, think about this as someone who often passes for straight. Like, people say, it's like the number of times that like I'm sitting with straight married women who literally half our hangout is them complaining about their horrible marriage, and then the other half is them being like, so how are we going to get you married? I'm like, no thanks. Like, I actually...
And are you guys okay?
Yeah, like, blink twice if you need help. Like, maybe a rescue operation. Like, and I think we are in this moment where nuclear families are... There's so much pressure on the nuclear family because nuclear families have become so atomized. They are so disconnected. Life is so expensive and painful. No one has the stay-at-home partner anymore, right? You have to have two incomes, and childcare is expensive. And basically, we live in a society in which we are all given a blueprint or a map through the maze, and the map doesn't work. People are like, I did all the right things, and it sucks. And how come you get to opt out? And so I think they hate us for our freedom.
I think I've come to very similar conclusions. I've never quoted George
I know,
Bush
fuck George W. Bush.
And I think you're right. I forget which theorist described it as an act of self-butchery, conforming to certain gender roles in particular, sexuality to a degree, but especially about gender. And that's often been in my mind when I think about the just rage and vitriol that people have towards other people being more free in their gender expression.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So you're talking a little bit about family, and this brings me to the book that you co-wrote with a friend of yours. Yes. So it is called Everything for Everyone. And one of the things you talk about in it, or one of the things it touches on, I believe, I'm halfway through it, is the idea of family abolition.
Yeah.
Right? Tell me about the book.
Yeah. So the book is a speculative fiction novel where we imagine the fall of capitalism and the nation state within the next, 4 decades. So we imagine the birth of a communized society. So this is not communism like Soviet Union communism. This isn't state communism. This is communization in which basically instead of like big nation states, we have people living in communities that are sort of geographically bound and co-producing everything they need to live. And so the book has been described as utopia, but also dystopia. I think there's a ton of dystopia so the conceit of the book, each chapter is a life history interview with a fictional character. So we project ourselves into the future as interviewers who are trying to document, the events of the revolution. And we're doing oral histories with people. And those folks range from people who lived primarily through the collapse of the current system, and then people who grew up in the communized new world. So family abolition is a big theme because we imagine a world in which our social reproduction, to use the academic term for it, is not tied to economics, right? So one of the fantasies of the capitalist state, right, or one of the fantasies that we have under capitalism is that our families, our kinship is driven primarily by love, right? We fall in love, we do whatever, and then, love keeps us in or pushes us out in its absence. But in reality, the family is an economic unit of production under capitalism. And kind of biggest litmus test you can ask yourself is like, if you stopped loving the people in your life, would your housing change? Would your access to childcare change? Would your income level change? And for most people, the answer is yes. All of those things are tied intimately to who we love and who, who we have sex with, who we live with, who we partner with. And so this is a future in which all of our basic material needs are met in a communal form. And then we're free to love and reproduce and create kinship that is not tied to our economic needs. And so we also imagine that we're technologically advanced, and actually the science is already on its way, that we're technologically advanced enough that anyone could gestate, that gestation doesn't necessarily have to be tied to parenting. If people don't want it to be, it can be. So yeah, it's a family abolitionist future. I will pitch that my co-author, Emmy O'Brien, has just published a nonfiction book on family abolition with Pluto Press that just came out this year. So I encourage folks who are excited about this topic to read that book.
And if you were going to flesh out what family abolition is specifically for people, I mean, prior to this, tipping my hand a little bit, I'd never heard the term that or had it unpacked. So how would you explain it?
Family abolition is about abolishing the nuclear family as an economic unit. So breaking down the tie between someone's economic well-being and someone's sort of kinship structure. So it's not that people don't have kinship or don't live with people they love or don't, or don't partner up. Or don't have children. It's more that none of that is tied to what your material resources are. So family abolition is not necessarily, I think of it as an intellectual current more so than a social movement current. So when we often think of abolitionist currents, we think of social movements. And definitely for me and for Emmy, my co-author, we think of family abolition as on the horizon of a post-capitalist future, as something we can kind of look forward to. And so right now, theorizing is about letting it happen, right? Is about creating the possibility in people's minds. It is very difficult to abolish the family under capitalism because capitalism relies on the family and reproduces the family in its forms, right? So relies on this kind of social reproductive work in order to sustain itself.
I think as queer people, or as a queer person, I'll speak for myself. As a queer person, I can see just the beautiful possibility in it. I've often thought to myself, last 25 or so years, I don't live in the kind of world that I think I would thrive in, right? Yeah. That just doesn't exist, just in terms of ties and kinship and what the reality has been for me and how unreadable that is to people from the outside. Yeah. So
I think that queer folks and trans folks are living the closest thing under capitalism to a family abolitionist future. I mean, in that we create our own families, often not tied by blood. Many of us end up in nuclear families still and sort of reproduce the same kind of structures as the broader system. But I think for a lot of queer folks, those structures are not seen as the end all be all of liberation. Like, we know that there is a kind of split within the broad umbrella of queerness between those who think that queer liberation means getting all the things straight people have versus the people who think that queer liberation is about questioning whether we want those things and having our questioning of those things be a mirror for society and be a way to open up possibilities for different futures.
I appreciate you saying that, and I think that might be one of the other currents behind the backlash now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
because of how threatening that possibility is.
People get really upset about this idea of abolishing the family, right? Family values are seen as so, important in these things. And as a sociologist of the family, I don't see why people are hanging on. I mean, I think we can see in some way, I mean, okay, we think of marriage, for example, cishet marriage, as this thing that like women want and men are trying to run away from until they're, well, whatever. But by almost every metric, women suffer from marriage and men benefit from it. men who get married live longer lives. They have better health outcomes. They make more money. They do less work in their house. And by almost every metric,
women are unhappier than single. Yeah.
And so of course, some people want to keep this together. And I think it's like the men want the benefits and the women who chose this are terrified, are frustrated that anyone else would have the freedom not to choose this, and so to hell with it, I say.
To hell. Yeah. That's great. That's great. So I'm curious about how the reception to, the book and the documentary, and also to your work as a publicly out queer Arab person and Muslim person has been. Just generally, you're putting all of this wonderful, needed, deeply radical work out into the world. How has that been for you?
First of all, thank you for saying that. That's so kind. It has been a journey and a half. It's interesting to me because when I came out as queer in the wake of Orlando, there was very little condemnation from Muslim Americans, right? This was me being like, no, Muslims aren't homophobes, like we can be queer and Muslim at the same time. Here we are, right? But recently, when I've been writing about the statement, when I've gotten a lot of pushback, especially on kind of vile trash heap social media platforms like Twitter. Not even just from the trolls with the 20 followers and the anime picture profile, but also even from people who should know better, getting a ton of pushback, and not all of it kind or
civil.
Or civil. I'm okay with people disagreeing with me. I'm an academic. We disagree all the time. Like I have very thick skin. Yeah, so I think the kind of level of vitriol has been really surprising, and it's hard because normally when I get vitriol online, it's from Islamophobes and sort of right wing jobs, and so to get it from my own community has been particularly jarring and depressing. That having been said, I think that the people I care about, the people I want to reach, have been overwhelmingly positive in their reaction to the book, to the film, to my work. One of the things that keeps me going is, I gave a lecture about my academic book project about women leaving Muslim communities. And I just got a flood of messages from young women saying, this is my life. Thank you for acknowledging the story. Thank you for telling this story. And that's what makes it worth it, right? Because it's so validating to know that you didn't fail individually, that you're not the problem, that there's actually like a social structure at play. There's a pattern, right? And it's not that you just ruined your chances because you went on a date in high school, or like because you don't wear hijab.
I mean, the stakes feel that high.
They really do. Yeah. Or like because you don't wear hijab, or like there are tons of nice Muslim boys, but they won't marry you for some reason. Like I think for women to be like, oh, this is a problem that is not fundamentally with me. It's a problem with the script and the tools that I've been given and the environment I find myself in. I think to me, that's my job. When I posted on Twitter, I posted data about the Muslims' views on homosexualities, and that's when I got all this pushback. But I'm like, what's the point? What's the point of having a platform and a degree and any of these things if I'm not going to use it for the things I care about? So I don't care. I do care. It hurts my feelings, but I'm not going to stop. And I know that I'm doing the work that I need to be doing and reaching the people I want to reach. And everybody else can, everybody else is easily blockable.
So the documentary is just starting to make the rounds. How's the reception to it been?
It's been great. I mean, it's weird right now because only like people at festivals are seeing it, and then a
select few people,
and then a few people are catching the virtual screenings. But everywhere that it's shown, my mom came with me to the world premiere at a film festival in Greece, and they loved her. Everybody was like, "We love your mom," and I was like, "Okay, great." If she's the star of the show, I'm very happy with that. Yeah, so So far, we've gotten really good receptions. I think people fundamentally understand the struggle to be seen by your parent or to understand your child, and how difficult it is to just show up and keep showing up, but also the kind of beauty in that. So it's been really lovely so far. I'm really excited to have it be seen by more queer Muslim audiences and Muslim audiences in general. So I'm looking forward to that.
One of the things that I especially appreciate about the film, about how you frame it, about the story that it tells, the person who produced it, the filmmaker, very perceptive, right? Because I think it captures this really important nuance. I came out to my father probably 20 years ago, right? We're getting on 20 years. And we're still in this weird interstitial space. We have not reached the other side of anything. He knows, and he's not thrilled. He's not an asshole, right? And it's not an easy cut and dry narrative. I know that my straight siblings, no matter what I think of their relationships, I know that he thinks that their marriages are more legitimate.
Yeah.
And that's this like weird in between that, we've just been living in. And we've definitely come around to each other and we mostly get along, even though, we don't always agree. So I really appreciate just having a portrayal of that narrative and the intricacies and the nuances and the pain, but also the beauty behind it.
Yeah.
Thank you for being willing to be followed around by a filmmaker for 6 years.
You're welcome. I'm so glad that came across. That was really important to me. It was very important to me that people understood just how long this all takes and how much work and that just because there isn't this aha moment doesn't mean anyone is doing it wrong or that it's not worth it.
Beautiful. So, okay, first of all, I don't know how you found the time to write an academic book and a novel and be the subject of a documentary and engage in your current research. And what do you have coming up, Eman?
What do I have coming up?
Or anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm working on the academic book. Stay tuned, look out. It's called Impossible Futures, Why Women Leave American Muslim Communities. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Eman Abdelhadi. You can also follow me on Instagram at Abdelhadi. I post all the things there when I remember to get on social media, which is intermittent at best.
Eman, thank you so much for talking to me, for taking the time, for sharing this beautiful work that you're putting out into the world.
It was genuinely such a pleasure to talk to you. It felt like hanging out with a friend.
Yeah. Speaking of friends, hello to our mutual who put us in touch.
Yes, hi.
All right, thank you. I've included links to Eman's socials and book in the show notes, as well as a link to Outfest, where you can catch the documentary virtually until July 30th of 2023. Follow her, watch the documentary, and let people know if you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.